Hey, welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, From Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is our 26th episode in the Journey Through the Scripture series. We hope that you've enjoyed the ride along the way. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit more about ourselves, how we got the name for the podcast, and provide several helpful resources to help you along your redemptive history journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questions that you can send to us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit that bell for notifications so you always know when we drop fresh content. We do post a new episode every Monday, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride with us through scriptures. Just to recap where we've been, if you were with us for the last episode too, or the last several, we've actually moved away from Sinai. And now that we've started to advance in redemptive history, one of the key headlines that we want to stamp for our audience is that even though we are geographically advancing and moving forward, and that Israel's plight and circumstances seems to be changing, their heart towards God has not changed too. And so this is a theme and a motif which we're going to continue to circle back to and stamp over the next couple of episodes too. We don't want that geographical progress in like any way to mislead our perception of what's actually happening. And at the end of the day, how God's fulfillment of these things will still occur through his true son, which is yet to come. With that framework in mind, Kit, I'd love to jump in with our first question. Like the monarchy era in Israel's history followed after the period of Judges, and yet the fundamental relational dynamic between Yahweh and his covenant son remain unchanged, as I just alluded to. Consider how this was the case viewed through the lens of Samuel's ministry and the circumstances surrounding Israel's attainment of its first human king in Saul.
Well, we talked last time about the fact that Samuel was the bridge between the period of the judges and the monarchy. He was actually the last of Israel's judges. Technically, he ordained his sons to take his place, but the people rejected them. But Samuel then takes us out of the period of the judges into this era of the monarchy. But the two periods in Israel's history are very tightly related. And even as we considered last time, we saw that the era of the judges, that 300 some years, is recorded for us in the book of Judges. And it's this repeated cycle in Israel's life of God giving them rest and a sense of settledness, deliverance from their enemies. This came out of the settlement of the land by Joshua, the partitioning of the land, but the people became complacent. And that complacency led them to begin to look away from the Lord, to begin to become more confident and self-reliant, to look towards other gods, to essentially just become wayward and depart from him. And God responded in each instance by bringing oppressors against them, oppressors who would persecute them, in a certain sense, even bring them into a kind of bondage, even though they were still within the land. And when that would happen, then the people would cry out and God would send them a deliverer, a judge. And that judge would then help them to gain liberation from whatever this bondage was, whatever this oppressing force was in the land, some Canaanite enemies, Philistine enemies. And then the whole process would start over again. That rest would put them back into that same cycle of complacency. So the period of the judges was a series of these men who were judges in Israel, but they were associated with this pattern, this cyclical pattern in the life of the people. And as we saw last time, probably the most pointed summary of what that period was like in Israel's history was that strange account of the man who's puts his concubine out there, the Israelite who puts his concubine out for the men in the town in the area of of Benjamin, and they rape and they end up killing her, and then he cuts her up and disperses the parts of her body to the rest of the 12 tribes as this way of indicting the tribe of Benjamin who have done this to a fellow Israelite. And the point of that episode is that it very closely parallels what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, which represented for the Jews and for the Old Testament history kind of this epitomizing human rebellion, unrighteousness, uncleanness against God. So the point of that is to say that during that era, we see that Israel, who was to be the light of the nations, who was to manifest God and truth to the nations around them, had become indistinguishable from the nations. They were, as it were, another Sodom and Gomorrah. And that is the era that then leads us into the monarchy. And even the monarchy itself, as we're going to see, reflected that same sort of unbelief, that same sort of unfaithfulness, that same sort of autonomy and a kind of self-serving orientation on the part of the people of Israel.
One of the things that we have talked about and even referenced last time is like this cycle seems to be not only habitual and perpetual, but one of the things that we really want to make sure our audience understands too is that it's not due to a lack of efforts on behalf of the Israelites, right? In terms of like their own beliefs and their own value in themselves. Talk about that, how like God is even using this cycle to like reveal their unfaithfulness, but yet in the midst of it, his faithfulness to continue to guide them and move them through this part of like their redemptive history. Speak about that a little bit and how we hold both of those in like equal measure.
Right. Well, in many ways, that repeated cycle during the era of the judges is almost like a redoing of the Egyptian circumstance over and over and over again. Israel, the family of Jacob had gone to Egypt and found rest from famine and death uh, at the hands of Joseph, and they lived in blessing and abundance and fullness in the land of Egypt under Joseph's care. But eventually you had Joseph dying, another Pharaoh coming along. Now, all of a sudden, that ease and that rest, as it were, turns to oppression and persecution and hardship. And the people cry out, and God hears, he remembers the covenant. And we saw when we looked at that, the text in Exodus doesn't say that they cried out to God. They just cried out in their affliction, but God heard. God remembered, and he remembered specifically his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God wasn't just simply saying, these people are suffering. I don't like that. I'm going to go rescue them. This was God honoring his covenant arrangement with Abraham and his descendants. And Moses was raised up and sent back to be this liberating agent corresponding to these judges during the era of the judges. But my point is that this same pattern is being repeated over and over again. Israel's unfaithfulness is manifested repeatedly in their departure from God. Even when they were in Egypt, they were worshiping other gods. They had adopted the practices of the Egyptians, and yet God was not going to let them go because he was faithful to his covenant that he had made, ultimately a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and therefore Israel, the descendants, for the sake of the world. This wasn't just about that people, but as we've said so many times, Israel was the people through whom God had covenanted to be the instrument for bringing his blessing to all the families of the earth. The Abrahamic people were chosen by God, covenanted by God to be the ones through whom he would undo the creational curse and ultimately the creational exile, bringing all things back to himself. And God was not going to let that project go. So even though the people were unfaithful, even though Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves were unfaithful, God was going to continue to be faithful, not just because that's who he is in his person, but because this intent for his creation was not something that he was willing to set aside or in any way forego. So Israel has to be seen in that light, and even their circumstances through the period of the judges and then through the monarchy period, all the way up to the time of the coming of the Messiah. God keeps holding them and preserving them. As Paul says, even the Torah that God gave them was a pedagogue to hold them and carry them and instruct them and prepare them for the day when they would finally attain to their fullness, find their fulfillment in this seed of Abraham who God had promised. And that's moving us a little farther down the road. But ultimately, that's, as we've said so many times, these are at the center of how we think about, as Jesus and his disciples put it, the Christ-centeredness of all of Israel's scriptures. Their whole history is Christ-centered, but in this sort of a way. Israel's history is building the case for the one who will come, who will be the true Israelite, who will be the one in whom Israel's election and Israel's vocation is fulfilled.
How did Samuel's role in Israel expose the fact that Israel's unbelief and unfaithfulness touched every dimension of its existence, including the ministration of the sanctuary, which served as the focal point of the nation's relationship with its covenant God?
Well, the book of Judges deals with the nation's covenant unfaithfulness and kind of as a principle that defined them, but it doesn't go into really much depth with respect to the priesthood and the priestly ministration. And that begins to emerge in the book of First Samuel in connection with Samuel and in connection with the functioning priest at that time, the high priest, who was Eli. Um, Eli had two sons, and these two sons, who kind of carried out the daily ministration, were using the sacrifices, the bringing of sacrifices to the Lord as a way to uh, enrich themselves. They were abusing the pattern that God had given to them for how these sacrifices were to be performed, how the priest was to derive his own foodstuffs from these sacrifices. And so they were just abusing their office. And the text says they were laying with women outside of the door of the sanctuary. And Eli, their father, knew about all of this and found fault, but he didn't really do anything about it. And in fact, he himself was profiting from it. But Samuel is in the center of this, in that as a little boy, he had been given over by his mother to the Lord, which at that time looked like him going and living within the kind of the realm of the tabernacle and its ministration. So he grew up as a little boy in connection with the sanctuary, which at that time was at Shiloh, under the oversight, under the tutelage of Eli. And Samuel ultimately became the prophetic voice that God used to confront Eli and to pronounce his condemnation on Eli, on his sons, and on that ultimately that priestly line. So Samuel is the instrument that God raises up as not only the last of the judges in Israel, but as the point of transition into the monarchy. But also he's kind of the spotlight that God uses to shine the light on the unrighteousness and the grievousness of the priesthood and the priestly ministration at that time.
Kid, speak a little bit about this following part, which I think really builds on what you just shared too, and we'll probably land here for a little bit. Though Eli objected his son's corruption of the priesthood, he was complicit in it by his failure to act divisively, or excuse me, decisively against them. How did his action and inaction demonstrate his own violation of covenant sonship?
Well, certainly as the presiding priest, he needed to set an example. He needed to be the one who, because the priests were consecrated to the Lord. If you remember, even in the kind of fitting out of Aaron as the high priest. The high priest would wear a turban that had a plaque on the front of it that said "Holy to the Lord," and that speaks of this absolute consecration to God. And even the Levites, who were the priests, were drawn from the Levites, but as we saw, the Levites also were the larger family of Israelites who were responsible for everything connected with the sanctuary and its ministration. So uh, they moved when Israel would move around, they would be responsible for packing things up and transporting things and setting them up. So the whole family of the Levites were holy to the Lord. They didn't have a land inheritance. They derived their livelihood from the ministration of the sanctuary. And so the presiding priest was to epitomize that no worldly, earthly attachment, but a person who is utterly consecrated to the Lord in his ministration. And that was to be Eli, and his sons were abusing that. They were using their status, their privilege, their ministration to profit themselves and to indulge themselves. And Eli knew that. And he did rebuke them, but he didn't stop them. And even when it became known that God was going to take these sons, when that was revealed to him, he said, "Well, this is the Lord's will, so be it." And but a little interesting thing in that account is that God, in that indictment, he says to Eli, but concerning him and his sons, "You have all fattened yourselves through this ministration." And when Eli finally dies, when he falls over backwards in his seat, it says that he was old and heavy. And so, in the shock of hearing of what happened to his sons in the ark, he falls over backward in his chair. So, if he's heavy, it's implying that he also has been, in a sense, eating of these products. The way his sons have been profiting by pulling offerings back from the Lord and using it for their own food. Eli's been partaking in that as well. At least that's the suggestion that you get from the text. And the way God speaks to him kind of points to the same thing. So we don't know exactly what were the total dynamics of his interactions with his sons. Obviously, he found fault with them and he rebuked them, but he didn't stop them. And it seems as if he himself was even deriving some profit from their unrighteousness.
Yeah, how do we balance like these two dynamics of action inaction? Like I really wanted to maybe sit with that for a little bit because I think even the audience might be wrestling with this. And it's like, well, what is the application for us, right? Like, how do we connect this to like our current reality and understanding of what does this mean in light of redemptive history? Because I think on one side, people would say is, well, like I see a lot of the things. And so am I complicit if I don't address each and every one of those? Or am I still faithful in terms of my witness and testimony if I see those things, but I don't feel compromised by those too? Like how do people wrestle with this? Because like I think it seems to be so foreign and distant from us what's happening here, Kit. But I do feel like there is near-term application to us. But like, how do we connect those dots there? I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, it's a big question, a big ethical question. It's a big spiritual question, and I guess in some sense the answer might be a little bit different within the household of faith than in the wider community. I guess in the broadest sense, God created the human race to be an interconnected, interdefining, um, accountable community. And so at the broadest level, the whole notion of human autonomy is not a biblical idea. The fact that I can do whatever I want, we kind of live in a time where the ethic is you can do whatever you want as long as nobody else is hurt. It doesn't really matter what you do if there are no victims, if you're not committing a
Sure.
crime against somebody. But what we fail to recognize is that unless you live in a cabin off the grid and have no human contact, everything that we do as human beings affects somebody else.
Right.
So there is no such thing as a victimless act, or I can do whatever I want as long as it doesn't affect anybody else. Well, that's impossible. So at a certain level, I think we have to think about our choices and our actions and inactions in terms of their effect on other people, because nothing's in a vacuum. But certainly as it pertains to the covenant house of Israel, and now this thing that we call the church, you see this throughout Israel's history, even to a point that it seems kind of strange that one man does something wrong and the whole nation suffers, or a
Right.
handful do something wrong and the whole nation suffers. Well, God was teaching them that Israel collectively is my son. And so the waywardness of the one affects the many. And in a certain sense, God treated Israel collectively.
Mhm.
Many could suffer because of the
Right.
unrighteousness of the one, and God treated Israel in that way. And you certainly see this in the New Testament with respect to the church. We're told that in Christ we are actually members of one another, so that um, my sorrow is the sorrow of the other. My joy is the joy of the other. My unrighteousness brings a kind of uncleanness and defilement and even a stumbling block into the body of Christ. So I think for us, it's foreign to us to think in that way. And even in the church, it's foreign to think that way, where we think, okay, it's me and God, and am I saved? Am I not saved? What's my destiny when I die? And everything else is kind of you know, irrelevant in the ultimate sense. What I do with other people, my relationship with other Christians, whatever, I can take it or leave it. It's just how am I in relation to God? Is he okay with me? Am I going to be saved? And am I saved? Will I go to heaven when I die? And even then, we think about that outcome being my best of all possible worlds. Heaven will be my perfect existence without really much consideration of any other people. And if I really like to be kind of a hermit now, I'll be the quintessential hermit
Right.
then, right? Nobody will bother me, and I'll just get to sit on my front porch and watch the sunset or whatever. So, but this idea of a community that are interrelated so intimately that what concerns the one concerns the many, and that playing off of one to the other, I think that makes us have to rethink these issues of again ethics and action and inaction. And God does hold us accountable to our inaction as much as to our action, just
Mhm.
as you see with Eli. Yes, he was profiting, but he wasn't the one who was himself abusing the priesthood.
Right.
But by implication, he was, because he was allowing this to continue on. And we can do this, in the church as well. We can turn the other way and say, oh, well, that's his business and that's not up to me and God will judge him or whatever. And that's all true. God will deal with us as individuals, and we can't nitpick and micromanage each other, but we have to recognize this obligation that we have to the well-being of the whole, and the effect that our actions and inactions, our thinking, our judgment, all of those things have on the body collectively.
Yeah, and I love just like your stamp on the idea of like corporateness kit too, and just so often we live in a very isolated and fractured society where not only is self like the reality and like the point of reference, but it's actually affirmed and elevated, right?
Right,
In fact, it's actually in your benefit to be self-referential and
right.
self-serving too, and it's actually promoted and celebrated too. Kind of like under that corporate framework, maybe speak to like our last question today is even as the Lord pronounced judgment on Eli and his household, how did he reveal that this would not be the final word for Aaron's priesthood in the near term, nor in the consummate fulfillment, as well as the corporate cosmic implications of what was actually unfolding right here as well? Speak to that a little bit.
Well, essentially, God's judgment pronounced against Eli and his house. Eli was told that his sons would die. They would die in the same day, and that there was going to be a kind of a curse on his that priesthood, that priestly line. It was going to continue. God wasn't going to cut it off entirely, but it was going to be, in a sense, depreciated and no longer carry the glory and the prominence that it had. And God also said this will come in connection with the distress upon my own dwelling place. And we're not there yet, but we'll see very shortly what happens is that the ark is taken, the ark representing God's throne, the footstool of his feet, the place of his enthronement, the focal point of his dwelling place. That ark is exiled, it's taken, captured by the Philistines, and it's outside of the land of Israel in the possession of pagans, and even put into their pagan temple for 7 months. And so Eli's sons die in connection with this, but here comes the distress to his sanctuary, the distress to his dwelling place. Well, over time, Eli's priestly line, and he's a descendant of Aaron. All the high priests are descendants of Aaron, and the priests in general. So that line becomes it maintains a certain significance, but it's ultimately eclipsed by a different priestly line associated with Zadok, and we don't necessarily want to go there at this point. But in connection with David and David's kingship, Zadok and then the Zadokian priesthood becomes ascendant, and the priestly line associated with Eli becomes descendant. It declines, and it becomes less and depreciated, even to the point that God had said to Eli, the priest to come from you will have to be, in a sense, pleading for a position within the priesthood in order to have bread to eat. It's a way of kind of expressing that that line's going to be depreciated. But God is still going to preserve the Aaronic priesthood and exalt it even through a man who represents a faithful priesthood, Zadok, who stands by David. And even when Absalom tries to usurp the kingdom, Zadok stands with David, and Solomon exalts him. This is all coming out in the future. But so that Zadok priesthood becomes a kind of first fulfillment of this promise of an ultimate, everlasting, faithful priesthood, in which these priests will actually do the Lord's will and love him and fulfill their calling. And that ultimately looks to Christ himself, who is that faithful, great high priest of a different order, of a different sort, who produces in himself a whole new community of regal priests, right? Priests, a new priesthood associated with him. So that's ultimately where this is going. And, we who are Christians and read the Old Testament, we who know the New Testament and what has come in Christ, we can see these echoes all the way back in the things that God was promising, and then the way through Israel's history that God brought about the fulfillment, but not in an ultimate sense until the Messiah himself comes.
Indeed, too. We sincerely hope this time you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit that bell for notification so you always know what's coming up next. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.